The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. Intimacy used to be a place where something could slow down, but over time it quietly adopted the same rules that govern work, achievement, and visibility, until closeness itself began to behave like a task that needs to be performed, evaluated, improved, and occasionally justified, not because anyone explicitly demanded it, but because the surrounding world taught the nervous system that nothing is allowed to exist without output. What once emerged from presence slowly shifted into demonstration, where bodies learned to move not according to sensation, but according to expectation, and where connection became less about listening and more about signaling that something is happening, that something is working, that something can be shown, even if no one is watching, because the internal witness had already absorbed the gaze of the world. In this space, desire did not disappear, but changed its posture, becoming cautious, strategic, and often exhausted, as if it knew that every movement would be measured against an invisible standard of intensity, frequency, responsiveness, and emotional correctness, turning intimacy into a subtle negotiation with an imagined scoreboard that never fully resets. The body adapted first, as it usually does, learning to comply before the mind had language for what was happening, learning patterns that looked like closeness from the outside while internally conserving energy, reducing sensitivity, and shortening the arc of attention, not out of dysfunction, but out of efficiency in an environment where even vulnerability had started to feel like labor. Partners often sense this shift without naming it, feeling moments where touch remained but presence thinned, where conversation continued but resonance faded, where rituals stayed intact yet something underneath them no longer responded with the same immediacy, creating a quiet confusion that was often misinterpreted as boredom, incompatibility, or loss of attraction. What was rarely considered was the possibility that intimacy itself had been overburdened, asked to carry proof of worth, emotional regulation, healing, validation, and identity, all at once, until it could no longer remain a place of rest, and instead became another interface where performance was unconsciously required. In such conditions, people did not withdraw because they lacked desire, but because desire no longer felt free to arrive unannounced, unoptimized, and without explanation, and when arrival requires preparation, consent forms, narratives, and outcomes, the organism naturally delays, hesitates, or disengages altogether. This disengagement was not a failure of love, nor a sign of emotional immaturity, but a biological response to saturation, similar to how muscles stop firing when overstimulated, or how attention drifts when every moment demands reaction, revealing that the system was not broken, only protecting itself from further extraction. Over time, a subtle realization began to surface, not as an idea, but as a felt shift, that intimacy did not actually need to prove anything to remain valid, that closeness did not owe productivity, intensity, or continuity to anyone, and that the most genuine moments often occurred when nothing was being attempted at all. This realization did not arrive with excitement, but with relief, as the body recognized a familiar absence of pressure, a space where touch could exist without intention, where silence could remain without being filled, and where proximity no longer needed to lead anywhere to justify itself. In this space, sexuality changed texture, becoming quieter, slower, and less performative, not because desire weakened, but because it was no longer mobilized by anxiety, comparison, or the need to confirm aliveness through reaction, allowing sensation to return to its original pace, which had always been incompatible with urgency. Partners encountering this shift sometimes mistook it for distance because the usual markers of engagement were no longer present, but underneath the absence of performance, a different form of contact began to form, one that relied less on expression and more on mutual regulation, shared stillness, and the capacity to remain without doing. Here, intimacy stopped being an event and returned to being a condition, something that could exist in the background of ordinary moments, in unremarkable gestures, in parallel presence, without demanding escalation, climax, or narrative closure, which paradoxically allowed depth to reappear without being forced. This change did not require discussion or agreement, because it was not a relational strategy, but a nervous system adaptation, similar to how the body lowers its guard when it no longer expects threat, and how attention softens when it is not constantly summoned to justify its focus. In this state, attraction no longer depended on stimulation alone, but on coherence, safety, and resonance, qualities that cannot be performed on demand, and therefore cannot be faked for long, revealing that much of what was previously labeled chemistry was often just synchronized urgency. As urgency dissolved, so did many unspoken contracts, including the belief that intimacy must always look a certain way, happen at a certain frequency, or fulfill a particular role in maintaining identity, allowing relationships to breathe outside the narrow corridor of expectation they had gradually entered. This breathing space was not dramatic, nor did it feel like progress, but more like something unnecessary had been quietly removed, leaving behind a simplicity that felt unfamiliar only because it had been absent for so long, hidden beneath layers of effort and interpretation. In this simplicity, partners sometimes discovered that they could remain close without constantly confirming it, that desire could ebb and flow without being managed, and that intimacy did not disappear in silence, but often deepened there, where nothing competed for attention. What emerged was not a new model of sexuality, nor a superior form of partnership, but a return to a state where closeness was allowed to be incomplete, inconsistent, and unremarkable, which paradoxically made it more sustainable than any optimized version that preceded it. This shift did not promise permanence, nor did it protect against loss, but it removed the burden of maintenance as identity work, allowing relationships to exist as living processes rather than achievements that must be defended, measured, or constantly renewed through effort. In this way, intimacy without performance did not reduce connection, but stripped it of excess function, revealing that much of what was previously believed to hold relationships together was actually the source of their quiet exhaustion. Nothing needed to be fixed for this to occur because the change was not corrective but subtractive, and once the pressure to perform dissolved, intimacy simply resumed its original behavior, arriving when conditions allowed, retreating when they did not, without apology or explanation. If you understand this, welcome to the club.